Something deeply unsettling is happening behind closed doors, and almost nobody is talking about it. Nearly $1.1 billion moved through a single account connected to Jeffrey Epstein, and a stack of Treasury records. Records that could answer some of the biggest questions in this case are being quietly locked away where the public can't see them. The people with the power to release those files aren't just delaying, they're refusing. And when you hear what investigators already uncovered from the small portions they were allowed to view, the question becomes unavoidable. What exactly is being hidden and why?
Sex trafficker. He was a serial rapist of women and young girls. And for some reason, the Trump administration, that claimed they'd be the most transparent administration ever, turned on a dime. The president had run on a campaign with a promise to expose the Epstein files. Now he and the Attorney General, Bondi, say, nope, nothing to investigate. When it comes to Epstein and sex trafficking, all these claims are just ludicrous. I want the American people to know that that's wrong. If you want to know why, just look at the latest report from our investigators that was discussed in the New York Times this morning. Now, somewhere in the Treasury Department, Mr. President, locked away in a cabinet drawer, is a big Epstein file that's full of actionable information. Follow the money details about his financing and operations that await investigation. Last year, the Biden administration allowed our investigators to look at portions of the file. We did that at the Treasury building. Here is what it says. Treasury's Epstein file details, Mr. President, 4,725 wire transfers. Let me repeat that. 4,725 wire transfers, adding up to nearly $1.1 billion flowing in and out of just one of Mr. Epstein's bank accounts. If you ask me, that is more than 4,000 potential lines of investigation right there. Hundreds of millions more flowed through other accounts. That's even a lot more to investigate. The file shows that Mr. Epstein used multiple Russian banks, which are now under sanctions, to process payments related to sex trafficking. A lot of the women and girls he targeted came from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and elsewhere. One shudders to think about the kinds of people who must have been involved in trafficking these women and young girls out of those companies and into the Epstein web of abuse. Again, these are all potential leads, Mr. President, the Department of Justice ought to be digging into. This is about years and years of international sex trafficking. None of this is a hoax. None of it is a scam. And I'd like to say I consider it insulting to the intelligence of the American people for the Trump administration to simply say there is nothing to investigate here. Now, when the Trump administration came in with a lot of fanfare about transparency and openness, I said, I'm going to follow up on that. So I wrote to the Attorney General, Ms. Bondi, Treasury Secretary Bessent, FBI Director Patel, and I asked them all to produce the Epstein file to the Senate Finance Committee so it could be reviewed. In fact, I've made that request multiple times. The Trump commitment to transparency based on the response didn't mean a whole lot because they just refused. Here's what one Treasury official wrote back to me. I'll quote here. The Department of Treasury has previously made documents available relating to the matter in response to your inquiries. Accordingly, we understand that you have the information you seek from the Treasury related to this request. We thank you for your attention to this important issue. Mr. President, for anybody who's familiar with how these discussions go in Washington, D.C., what I just read was code for the bureaucracy saying, you're asking for information, go pound sand. The Trump administration may be trying to close the books on the Epstein sex trafficking. But I want it understood, as a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, where we spend a lot of time looking at where substantial sums of money are going, particularly if they may be promoting wrongdoing and helping to evade taxes. We are going to stay on this fight to hold the wealthy individuals accountable for the harm that they clearly were involved in injuring the young women and others in this sex trafficking. So I'm going to have more follow-up for Attorney General Bondi very quickly. As for today, Mr. President, if she doesn't want to do the investigating, doesn't want the DOJ to do it, let me just restate my original demand. Have that Treasury information given to the Senate Finance Committee and have us on a bipartisan basis do our work. That's what we do in important investigations. If the Trump people believe they need additional authority to carry out the requests that I make again this afternoon, let me offer to help them write the bill myself. The idea that there is nothing more to investigate, not when you have 4,000 wire transfers, many of them associated with the possibility of wrongdoing and sex traffic promoting. The idea that you have that and there's nothing to investigate when it comes to the Epstein sex trafficking operation is ridiculous. Pam Bondi was the Attorney General in the state of Florida, where a lot of the Epstein crimes were committed. The Attorney General ought to know better, of all people. Mr. President, I can't begin to understand the President's handling of this or why he thinks this is just going to go away. But I'm here to say that our investigators have spent 3 full years looking into this. And the reason why is because we feel so strongly about the horror of sex trafficking and our commitment to root it out. The President of the Senate is new to this body, but I'm sure he's dealt with these issues before. You can't have a much bigger horror in front of you than sex trafficking abuse. So we're talking about real evil done to women and girls by Jeffrey Epstein. And Mr. President, nobody gets to sweep that under the rug. I yield the floor.
For years, the Epstein case has been surrounded by secrecy, missing documents, and unexplained decisions. But nothing compares to the financial trail buried inside the Treasury. These aren't rumors, they're numbers, thousands of wire transfers, millions at a time, spread across multiple countries, banks, and individuals. And when auditors inside the government say the full file is packed with actionable information, it raises a chilling possibility. Maybe the most explosive part of the Epstein story has never been revealed to the public at all. Investigators were granted a brief window, just a glimpse, into a portion of the Treasury's Epstein file. Inside those restricted pages, they found 4,725 wire transfers connected to a single account. Think about that. Not 40 transfers. Not 400. 4,725. Each one a breadcrumb leading somewhere. An associate, a collaborator, a financial route, a potential facilitator, or someone quietly benefiting behind the scenes. And the total? Just under $1.1 billion. That's one account, one small slice of an enormous network. And that was only the beginning. Hundreds of millions more flowed through other accounts tied to Epstein, including transactions routed through Russian banks now under international sanctions. The Treasury flagged these payments because they weren't random. They were linked to people and locations directly tied to the movement of women and girls across borders. Victims came from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and other regions where trafficking networks often operate in the shadows. So when investigators say these payments aren't just numbers, they're signals, they mean it. These transfers map out how people were moved, who funded what, and which institutions looked the other way. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. After investigators saw portions of the file, they requested access again to continue the review. This time the answer wasn't "not now." It was simply no. The Treasury's written response was almost dismissive, claiming that investigators already have the information they need. But that statement wasn't true. They'd only seen a limited sample. And everyone involved knows that in Washington, a message like that isn't just a denial. It's a coded way of saying, stop asking. Imagine coming across a vault filled with clues, names, accounts, transactions, patterns, and being told you're not allowed to open it. That's what happened here. The Treasury insisted that previous administrations had already provided what was necessary, despite knowing that thousands of financial entries remained untouched. It's not standard procedure. It's obstruction disguised as bureaucracy. And this brought even more attention to the one person whose job it was to enforce transparency, Pam Bondi. As the leading official at the DOJ, she had the authority to give Congress access to those documents. She had the ability to greenlight the release of information that could expose a web of trafficking networks and uncover the individuals who helped make Epstein's operation so massive. But instead of pushing for sunlight, she repeatedly shut down attempts to obtain the full record. What makes that decision so alarming is that many of Epstein's crimes happened in Florida, the state where Bondi served as Attorney General for years. If anyone should understand the magnitude of what was hidden, it's her. Bondi's office had been asked multiple times to produce the full Epstein file. Not a summary, not a curated selection, the entire thing. Each time the answer was the same. A refusal. A quiet bureaucratic no that effectively blocked oversight. And that left investigators with a haunting question. If the limited information they'd seen already pointed to international trafficking routes, sanctioned banks, and more than $1 billion in unexplained movement, what was hiding in the rest of the file? The mystery grew deeper as analysts examined the few documents they could access. They found payments routed through smaller regional banks, places not normally associated with high-net-worth clients. They found transfers occurring at strange hours, routed through multiple countries before returning to the U.S. They found patterns that matched known trafficking operations, including sudden bursts of activity followed by months of silence. These weren't casual transactions. They were calculated, deliberate, and hidden. And the sheer number of them suggests Epstein wasn't acting alone. No one moves nearly 5,000 transfers at this scale without a network. But with each discovery came a wall. When investigators tried to trace foreign accounts, the Treasury blocked it. When they sought cooperation from the DOJ, the door stayed shut. The claim was always the same: nothing further to investigate. That phrase, repeated over and over, became its own kind of warning. Because when institutions refuse to reveal documents, it's rarely because the documents are boring. It's because the documents matter. Analysts inside the Senate spent 3 years digging into the financial networks behind Epstein's operations. They worked through leads, cross-checked bank patterns, flagged unusual behavior, and mapped out the digital fingerprints left behind by each transfer. They weren't chasing rumors, they were chasing data. Real transactions, real money, real moves. And the more they uncovered, the more obvious it became that the official narrative, that there was nothing left worth looking into, didn't align with the evidence. And here's the part that should worry everyone watching. There is no innocent explanation for a government refusing to hand over financial records tied to one of the most notorious traffickers in modern history. If these documents truly contain nothing new, they would have been released immediately to silence critics. Instead, they were locked away. Not misplaced. Not delayed. Locked. Think of how many people are potentially involved. Financial institutions that processed the transfers, individuals who received payments, companies that moved funds without asking questions, middlemen operating in multiple countries, and others who may not have directly participated but certainly benefited. This is the type of network that doesn't just exist on its own. It's supported by powerful individuals with deep connections in politics, finance, and global institutions. And it raises a chilling thought. What if the names tied to those transactions are too explosive to reveal? What if the hidden file contains information that would crumble the public image of people who operated in the shadows for years, believing their secrets were untouchable? What if exposing the truth threatens not just reputations, but entire systems? Bondi's refusal to open the file doesn't quiet those questions. It amplifies them, because transparency only threatens those who fear what the truth will expose. And as investigators point out, each of those 4,725 wire transfers isn't just financial data. It could be a lead to a victim whose story was never fully documented. A transfer linked to someone transported across borders. A transaction tied to a recruiter, a handler, or an enabler. This isn't about sensationalism. It's about justice. Every unexplored transfer represents someone who may never receive accountability unless that file is opened. What makes this even more alarming is the global nature of Epstein's network. Victims didn't come from one country, one city, or one background. They were targeted from across continents, often from vulnerable regions where corruption and trafficking intersect. Russia, Belarus, Turkey, other parts of Eastern Europe, places where small groups can operate in secrecy, and moving people across borders becomes easier when someone with money smooths the pathway. The Treasury file shows these routes clearly. International patterns don't lie. Yet somehow the DOJ insists there's nothing to follow up on. It's a claim so illogical, so dismissive, that investigators openly called it an insult to the intelligence of the American public. And they're right. If thousands of wire transfers linked to a trafficker don't merit investigation, what does? If sanctioned banks processing those payments don't raise alarms, what will? If the very agencies responsible for protecting the public refuse to examine evidence sitting inside their own cabinets, what does that say about who's really being protected? The answer is unsettling. When powerful people are involved, secrecy becomes standard, silence becomes strategy, and transparency becomes the enemy. That's why investigators have pushed harder, demanding access to the full Treasury file and calling out Bondi's refusal to authorize its release. They've said publicly that if the DOJ won't investigate, then Congress must. They've vowed to draft new legislation if necessary. They've made it clear that silence is not an option, not when victims are still waiting for justice. And the most striking part, after 3 years of reviewing what little they were given, investigators said something that should haunt every viewer. We've only scratched the surface. Only scratch the surface. If the surface already reveals a billion-dollar money trail, sanctioned banks, international movements, and thousands of transactions tied to exploitation, what lies beneath? As long as that file stays locked, the world may never know the full truth about Epstein's network, the people who enabled it, and the institutions that failed to stop it. And that's exactly why this story matters. Because victims deserve answers, families deserve closure, and the public deserves to know what is being kept from them. Until that file is opened, the mystery remains. The secrecy continues. And the question lingers overhead like a shadow. What are they hiding? If you want more deep dive breakdowns, more investigations, and more stories exposing what powerful institutions don't want you to see, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There's a lot more coming, and you don't want to miss any of it.